Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining me today for this seminar. My name is Joseph Kalmenovitz. I'm an assistant professor of finance here at the Simon Business School, and I'm very excited to share with you 7 insights from my research on the economics of regulation. So first of all, let me introduce myself really briefly. I'm an assistant professor of finance here at Simon. I obtained my PhD from New York University in 2020. A little bit before that, I had a somewhat unusual career trajectory. So I actually started my career as an attorney. I obtained a law degree from the Hebrew University in my home country in Israel. And for 3 years, I worked as an attorney, a senior law clerk at the Supreme Court of Israel. So naturally, my research nowadays combines both my expertise from law and finance. And specifically, what I am working on is called the economics of regulation, which is what I'm going to talk about in the next couple of minutes. My research has been, some of that has already been published in some of the top publications in the profession. I usually speak at conferences and seminars. Actually, just this morning, we presented our work at the Federal Reserve. We did that on Zoom, obviously. And this is this whole area of economics of regulation is super exciting and a lot of interesting things. And I'm looking forward to the Q&A. So what is the economics of regulation? It starts with the following idea. Regulation is one of these areas in economics that on one hand is very important, but on the other hand, it is understudied. So everybody understands that regulation is important. Regulation is basically when the government is telling us, individuals and companies, what to do. So naturally, regulation affects every business decision. It's going to tell companies how to raise capital, how to manage their workforce, how to manage their environmental responsibilities. So it's clearly important. At the same time, regulation is relatively understudied in academia. And what I mean by understudied is that until recently, regulation has been sort of torn off between 2 extremes. On one hand, we had really big picture, 30,000 feet theories of regulation, how people think regulation is. We had those big words like regulatory capture, public choice, public interest. All of that is in theory. These are ideas, how we think regulation is. But when you look at the hard evidence, there is a collection of papers. Each one of them is taking one rule at a time and studies what happens if we change one little detail in this particular rule, what are the costs and benefits. So as you can see, there is a huge gap between the big theories about regulation and what we actually know about regulation as a whole. And that is the subject of what I am studying. This is the economics of regulation. Our approach, and when I say ours, I mean myself, my co-authors, and a group of young scholars in economics and finance who work on this topic, our approach is a data-driven, quantitative approach to really understand what is going on in regulation. And we ask very basic questions that nobody has asked so far. How much regulation do we even have? Who is behind those regulations? Who is writing regulations? Who is enforcing those regulations? And most importantly, how do companies in the real world respond to regulation, not to one rule at a time, but to the real regulation, which is a collection of thousands and thousands of different regulations. What I'm going to do the next couple of slides is share with you 7 key insights from my research. The first insight is, in order to really understand regulation in a data-driven, quantitative approach in the spirit of Simon Business School, you need to combine 2 things. You need to combine big data, and you need to deploy really sophisticated machine learning technique in order to understand this data. Now, the good news is that there is a lot of data about regulation. So let me give you some example from my research. Every day, the federal government has a newspaper. This is called the Federal Register. It is published every day by the federal government. It's about 500 pages on average every day. And in this Federal Register, the government describes to us in a lot of words, what exactly are they doing? What are the rules that the government is working on? What kind of enforcement action are they taking? What kind of taxes are they imposing? And so on and so on. So there's a lot of data that describes regulation. Another example is the Unified Agenda. Unified Agenda is basically a book published by the government twice a year. And in this book, the government goes into a lot of detail explaining to us, the citizens, the scholars, people who are interested in regulation, explain to us what are the rules that the government is currently working on. So the data is out there. You just need to know where to look. The problem is that once you collect all of that data, it's really hard to make sense of it. And remember, we want to take all of that data and convert it into something that is tangible, something that is useful for us to understand regulation. And in order to do that, we use a collection of artificial intelligence tools. We borrow from computer sciences, from linguistic sciences. So for example, by we, again, I mean myself, my co-authors, and my other colleagues, we use Python and R in order to track the government website and scrape the data every day. Once we have that data, we're going to train machine learning algorithms that would unleash them on this entire data set and help us understand what is going on. We're going to break down the data using a technique called LDA, latent direct allocation, and so on and so on. And a combination of data and techniques, excuse me, is going to give us an opportunity to understand the economics of regulation. And the next 6 takeaways, I'm going to walk you through some of the things that we now know about regulation thanks to this data-driven approach. The first thing that we learn, if you want to understand the quantity of regulation of the economy, we need to move from how many to how much. And what I mean by that in the past, when people were thinking about regulation, all they did was count the number of rules. How many rules do we have in the economy? The problem is that not all rules are born equal. Some rules are really burdensome. Some rules are kind of minuscule and not very important. If you want to understand the quantity of regulation, you need to be much more rigorous and sophisticated. And this is what I did in the paper that I put here on the slide. What I did is basically I asked the company, how much are you really paying in order to comply with federal regulations? How many hours do you spend in order to prepare yourself to comply? How many dollars do you spend on accountants, compliance officers, attorneys, and so on? I took all of that data, I kind of juiced out of it a single measure, which is what you see here. I call it the regulatory intensity index. And this captures the real cost of compliance starting from the 1980s, and it is available for every single firm. And by the way, those of you who are interested, my website, my academic website is open for everybody. You're free to take a look at the papers, at the underlying data, and shoot me a message during this Q&A or afterward if you're really interested. The second takeaway, or the third in total, is what happens inside the federal government matters. The way the government organizes itself is important. Think about it in the following way. Suppose I told you that there are only 10 regulations in the United States. Obviously, that's not the case, but just for the sake of example. Suppose there are only 10 regulations in the US and they're all handled by a single federal agency. Now suppose that we take 5 of those 10 and transfer them to a different agency. In other words, the quantity of regulation, exactly the same. The only difference is that now it's going to be handled by 2 different federal agencies rather than by a single. This is something that my co-authors and I call regulatory fragmentation, because regulation is fragmented across many agencies. And what we did in this paper is, first of all, we used new data to show that fragmentation is unfortunately a very persistent problem in the United States. Almost every single regulatory area is fragmented. You have many, many different agencies who try to work on the same thing, and they're not really coordinated. Because of that, this is going to create a serious burden on companies. It's going to raise the cost that companies pay, and it's going to reduce their profits. And if you want to think of a contemporary example, think about crypto markets, if you would like. Crypto markets nowadays are regulated by many different federal agencies. None of them is coordinated with the other. And because of that, we already start seeing the problem. For instance, the collapse of Signature Bank, which had a high exposure to crypto markets. Perhaps this was driven in part by regulatory fragmentation. The next takeaway is about potential regulation. So think about it this way. One source of burden is effective regulations. These are rules that are currently in place, they're coded in the book, and they're binding. And these are source of burden. But at the same time, the federal government has a huge pipeline of potential regulations. These are rules that the federal government is still considering. They're not effective, they're not binding, but one day they will become rules. It turns out that this rulemaking pipeline, these ideas, these proposals, is a huge source of burden on companies. And this is the subject of another paper that I recently released. So for instance, one of the things that we learn is that every single day, including today, the federal government works at least on 3,500 proposed regulations. Remember, these are not binding regulations, these are just plans or ideas. Every day, 3,500. In addition, we know, based on our data, we know that the average regulation, the average proposed regulation, is going to spend at least 2 years in the pipeline. It takes a very long time to finalize the regulation. Not only that, we know that 1 in 3 regulation would never happen. It's going to spend 2 years in the pipeline and then just die. We'll never hear about it. So based on all of these facts, we were really surprised to see that companies are going to pay a very heavy price because of this rulemaking pipeline. And the main reason is because it creates huge uncertainty. Think about it from the perspective of the firm. Not only do they have to handle effective regulation, cost of compliance, fragmentation, they also need to think, wait, what is going to happen 2 years from now? How many rules am I going to have to comply with? And this creates a lot of, is going to depress capital investment in the fight. Now, so far, I've talked a lot about the cost of regulation or sort of the bad implications. I don't want you to walk away from this webinar thinking, well, regulation is a bad thing. Let's get rid of all of that. You know, this is sort of an old school thinking about regulation. And our approach to people who work in this field is to think about it in a more rigorous, data-driven way. And clearly, there are also benefits to regulation. To give you a simple example, we all agree that we need airplane safety regulation. Nobody wants to see airplanes falling off the sky, right? So there are clear benefits for regulation. The problem is, from an academic perspective, it's sometimes really hard to detect them, statistically speaking, but I want to give you a couple of examples of what are the advantages of potential advantages of regulation. One of them is that regulation is not going to have the same effect on everybody. Regulation is going to pick winners and losers. So what I learned from all of my papers is that when you separate firms into 2 groups, you're going to see that the effect is much, much stronger on small firms, young firms, and firms that are financially constrained. Another way to say that is to say that regulation is picking winners and losers. Whenever you release new regulations into the economy, some companies are going to suffer. They're going to pay high costs, lose profits, shrink, and maybe disappear, but some companies are actually going to win. And those companies are typically going to be the bigger companies, the older companies, those who know how to manipulate regulation. They typically benefit a lot from regulation. So this is one takeaway I wanted to highlight. Another thing I wanted to highlight is that perhaps regulation can add value or can be beneficial from a different perspective. And I want to give you a couple of examples along those lines. So one thing that I learned as I was working on this field is that there is a lot of overlap in regulation. Think about it this way. We have 2 firms. Each one of them has a unique combination of regulations that they have to comply with. Now, some of those regulations are going to overlap. There's going to be some similarity between these 2 firms, some similar regulatory challenges. We call this phenomenon regulatory peers, and we have a paper on this subject. This is the left side of the screen that you see here. Regulatory peers are companies that generally are not very similar to each other, but as it turns out, they have similar regulatory problems. They talk to the same federal agencies, they comply with the same rules. Now, why is this beneficial? Because what we learn is that companies are watching each other and they're learning from each other behavior. For example, if I'm subject to a lot of regulations and I'm not sure what they mean, I don't know how to interpret them, I don't know how to respond to them, I'm going to look at my regulatory peer, another company that has the same regulation, and I'm going to learn from their behavior. In other words, they're going to be positive peer effect externalities that are going to help companies handle regulation. Now, relating to that, this is the right side of this slide. Because there are regulatory similarities, because there are overlaps, it turns out that this is an opportunity to merge. Think again about those 2 firms. They have some overlap in regulation. If those 2 companies merge, they're going to save costs. In other words, this is a classic bottom line synergy. And indeed, what we find in this other paper is that companies that have similar regulatory problems, they're much more likely to merge with each other. And after the merger, they're going to cut their costs and increase value for shareholders. And this is another way to say that regulation clearly has some values, for example, regulatory synergies. The last thing I want to mention before we turn to the Q&A, never forget the human factor, meaning a lot of people tend to think about the federal government as sort of a faceless organization, a huge body of some machine that takes orders and execute those orders in a rational, unbiased way. Now, obviously, this is not true because this bureaucracy, is comprised of millions of federal employees. These are real people who go to work every day. They're interpreting regulation, they're writing regulation, and then they're also going to enforce those regulations. And these are real people. They have incentives, they have biases, they have constraints. So what I do in my other line of research is I collect a lot of biographical information on the entire body of federal employees. And I have on my computer, for example, the payroll data of 50 million federal employees over the last half a century. And what I'm trying to do in these papers is to track what are they doing, how do they respond to incentives, how are they going to change regulatory burden in response to different changes. I want to give a couple of examples before we conclude. So on the left side, you see that these people respond very strongly to promotion incentives. What I did in this paper, which is now published already, is I took a group of attorneys from the Securities and Exchange Commission. That's the SEC. This is the primary regulator of financial markets. I took this group of attorneys and I wanted to understand what happens if I bump the salary of the top guy at the SEC, the manager. How would the guys at the bottom of the hierarchy, the low-rank employees, respond? Now, it turns out that these guys at the bottom of the hierarchy, they're going to start enforcing financial regulation much more strictly. They're filing more enforcement actions. They're going after the big will. They're requesting bigger penalties. And when you think about that, it actually makes a lot of sense because when you bump the salary of the boss, people at the bottom are going to start to compete in order to get a promotion. In other words, increasing the pay gaps inside the SEC is going to generate promotion incentives. So this is one thing that is really going to improve the way regulation is being enacted if you provide strong promotion incentives inside the federal government. In addition to that, what we learn is that people who work at the federal government not just respond to internal promotion incentives, they also respond to outside job opportunities. But let me give you one example here. That's the middle figure. When we look at the distribution of salaries in the federal government, how much people are making, what we observe is that there is a huge concentration of people who are just below this red line. This is a sort of threshold. For some reason, these people are really trying to make a little bit less than the red line. And we ask ourselves, what is so important about this red line? It turns out that if you make more than the red line, then you cannot leave the federal government without getting a penalty. If you leave the federal government, you are subject to a cooling off period. You're not allowed to use your government experience for 1 year. And that makes a lot of sense. What this figure tells you is that people in the federal government care a lot about their outside jobs. They're willing to sacrifice their paycheck in the government, stay just below the red line in order to be able to quit the federal government whenever they want. In other words, federal employees care a lot about outside job opportunities. So I'm going to skip the last part in the interest of time. Let me conclude. So what do we learn? What is the economics of regulation? The economics of regulation is a data-driven, quantitative approach to really understand what is going on in regulation. And we're going to use a combination of data and new techniques. This was takeaway number one. And this is how we're going to understand the economics of regulation. A couple of things that we know so far based on this new approach. First of all, we can quantify different aspects of regulation. We can tell you how much companies pay in dollars, in hours, in labor. How much do they pay to comply with rules? We can tell you that companies care not only about how many rules, they also care about which agencies regulate them, the fragmentation of regulation. We also know that companies care not just about effective rules, but they also care about potential rules. This is the federal government's pipeline. The other thing that we know is that companies are split. Regulation can, first of all, create winners or losers. Regulation can add a lot of cost, but regulation also has some value. For example, it is going to motivate companies to merge. It is going to motivate companies to look at each other. And the last thing that we learn is about the human factor. Regulation is not something that descends on us from heaven. It is written and enforced by people. Those people are the human factor. They respond to a variety of incentives. And we can learn a lot of interesting things by looking at those people. So I'm going to conclude here, and I think we can move. We have a couple of minutes where we can address some of the questions that people came up with. So I received a couple of questions before the seminar. So one question was about, I believe, the consumer, smart consumer regulations. Is that correct? Yes. So, and the question was whether when there are more environmental regulation in the New York State in particular, or in the federal government in general, whether companies are going to spend more on capital investment. And that's a very interesting question. And there are two things that I can say based on my research. The first thing is that we know that environmental regulation in general can motivate companies to invest more. So think about it for a simple way. If the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, is going to require companies to monitor the amount of emissions that they have into the environment, then yes, companies are going to build more. They're going to spend more on capital investment. And that is almost entirely true. But there's one thing I want to highlight, and that is the uncertainty component. So as it turns out, regulation can affect capital investment on the economy because it increases the uncertainty that companies are facing. And uncertainty is really bad for capital investment. Why would regulation increase uncertainty? Well, I showed you one example when you think about the government pipeline or the rulemaking pipeline. When you start working on new regulations, it's going to take 2 years until they actually become effective. And during this entire time, companies just don't know, what are they supposed to do? Are they supposed to invest more? Are they supposed to invest less? So it's going to create a lot of uncertainty by working on regulation. And that uncertainty is really bad for capital investment. So these are kind of the two forces that are at play, and they directly affect capital investment. Another question that I got before I started this seminar is which regulation or which change in regulation is going to have the biggest impact on the economy? And I think this is a fantastic question. I wish I had a great answer for that. And let me tell you at least one thing that is really important in that regard. Regulation is a sort of a cat and mouse game, meaning you don't need to think about regulation as something that just comes as is and we dump it on companies. Regulation is a flexible object. And what I learned from my research is that companies do as much as they can in order to change regulation and shape it. In other words, if companies think that there's going to be a very costly regulation, they're going to do whatever they can in order to reduce the economic impact. And they're going to fight with regulators, send letters, have meetings, try to recruit regulators, try to entice regulators. There are going to be a lot of techniques that companies are adopting in order to make sure that regulation is not going to hurt their business. So when we try to think, which regulation is going to have the biggest economic impact, it's not going to matter a lot because companies have the ability to block that and fight against this really, really burdensome regulation. So I hope this answered the question. I see that we have many, many Q&As over here. I'm going to try to answer them as far as I can. So the first question is, how can the AI models like BART or ChatGPT create an impact on the economy of regulation? That's a very interesting question. And the way I think about this is related to something that is called RegTech. RegTech is essentially a rising industry that has started probably after the financial crisis, where there is a sector in the economy or a segment of the tech industry that is trying to develop new rules that would actually reduce the cost of compliance. Think about TurboTax as an example. Instead of going to an accountant and driving back and forth and so on, you go online, you click, and in 1 hour you're done. So in other words, AI models, a variety of AI models or more sophisticated technologies can actually reduce the cost of compliance. And this is something that many regulators are really aware of. And some of them openly try to encourage this type. And this is actually a nice example of how regulation can have positive impact on the economy. Because we have so much regulation, some companies have an incentive to innovate new techniques to help reduce the burden of regulation. The other question that I see not exactly about regulation, but in point number 7, does that red line where employees can't use government experience for a year amount to a de facto non-compete enforced by the federal government? So David, thank you for your question. This is exactly what happened. So in the federal government, if you're a senior employee above the threshold, then you have a de facto non-compete for 1 year, which is much more stringent than the non-competes that we have, because if you work in the private sector, the non-compete is typically for 6 months. In the federal government, it is for an entire year, only if you're a senior employee. So what we found in our research, which is pretty cool, is that employees do whatever they can to not become senior employees in the federal government, because they would like to compete against the government. And this is exactly why we think this is a pretty cool evidence that federal employees are always watching their outside job opportunities and they behave accordingly. The other question that I see, how can regulation on companies help to decrease today's inflation? Well, that's thank you for that question. I see that Shane is going to answer this question live. Shane, would you like to jump in?
Sorry, I was just marking it answered live. You can continue to go.
Oh, continue to go. All right, that's great. Yes, sorry for the tech glitch. So that's a really interesting. Thank you, Crizel. So you're asking basically how can we fight inflation? Which is almost the topic of the day. So that's a very complicated question. I'm probably not going to answer it in the minute and a half that I have for this entire Q&A. The basic question that you need to ask yourself is, where does inflation come from? Right? What is driving inflation? Is this less supply? Is this over demand? Now, one thing I would say is the study of regulation that I do, which is focused on, let's call it the supply side of companies, a very, very simplistic answer would say, let's reduce the costs of companies in order to allow them to supply more goods into the economy. And that would hopefully depress inflation. Now, as we have all read in the past couple of weeks, we're not entirely sure what is the right toolkit to find inflation. It creates a lot of complexity. So one way, by raising interest rates, you may fight inflation, but then you can trigger a banking crisis. So I don't want to, to go too far into this point. We don't want to create more troubles than we already have. Another question from Philip is, has this been studied across different levels or forms of competition, i.e. oligopolistic competition? That's a very interesting question, Philip, thank you. So one thing that we learned, one thing that I learned from the papers that I've been working on is that regulation generally raises barriers for entry. Think about if you're a young firm, or if you have an idea for a young firm and you want to kind of break into a new market, you have to innovate something new, but you also have to learn to master all of the regulations that apply to this industry that you're trying to get into. It turns out that this becomes more and more complicated. The more regulation that you have, the higher the barriers for entry are, the harder it is for new people to come in. And there are a lot of studies that try to understand, why do we see such a decline in competitive environment in the United States? Perhaps one reason that we learned from my research, maybe there's too much regulation. It just becomes too hard to break into new industries. So another question from Scott is, on your opening slide, you said that regulations tell companies what to do. What was that a specific choice of word? I thought of regulation often as limits or guardrails. How many regulations tell companies what to do versus enforcing limits? So thank you, Scott. I think that we can debate this a little bit back and forth. Some regulations are very concrete in the sense that they are going to dictate to companies prices. That is a very specific dictate. Sometimes regulations are going to require companies to file forms that tells the regulators what the company is doing. So I do think that it is fair to say that regulation is going to dictate to companies what to do. Another related question, which I don't know if this was your intention, there is something called soft regulation, meaning sometimes regulators don't have to actually enact a new regulation that would specifically tell companies what to do. What they can do instead is to release soft information. They could have a public speech announcing in general what they think companies should do. This is not binding, but this is a very important way for regulators to discipline markets. This is an open area of research, and I'm glad you brought this up. Now, Andrew is asking, do other countries have a better way of implementing financial regulation, or is the United States unique? That is a very, very interesting question. I don't know much about other countries except for my home country, Israel. There's definitely pros and cons to the way things are done here. The thing in the United States, you cannot really disentangle regulation from the, I would call it the broad institutional setting of the United States. For instance, the US is has a federal way of structuring the government. You have federal and states. You have the Constitution, you have Bill of Rights. So, regulation is only part of that fabric. And one thing I know is that you can't change only the financial regulation while keeping everything else the same, meaning that financial regulation in the United States, the fact that it is so fragmented, so costly, so complicated, is part of what makes the US for better and worse. So the last question is from Janir, but I think we are out of time. Shane, is that right?
Correct.
Great. All right. So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for the lively discussion. Feel free to reach out. My website is open for everybody, and have a good rest of the day.